Deep beneath the earth, a forbidden realm is said to exist, and it's not unprotected. Ancient texts warn of guarded entrances, unseen forces, and those who never returned after getting too close. If Agartha is real, something is actively keeping it hidden. The question is, who or what stands watch? Records, boundaries, and early mentions. In the 19th century, references to an inner world beneath the earth appeared intermittently in travel accounts, scientific correspondence, and private diaries. These mentions were rarely framed as discoveries. They were recorded as marginal notes, second-hand reports, or geographic curiosities. One of the earliest widely cited examples comes from the papers of John Cleave Sims, Jr., an American Army officer who, in 1818, circulated a printed circular proposing openings at the poles. His pamphlet, distributed to universities and government offices, avoided vivid language and relied instead on measurements, latitudes, and a restrained tone that reflected the conventions of the period. Sims's ideas did not gain formal acceptance, yet they entered the record. By the 1820s, references to polar openings appeared in lecture halls in Cincinnati and St. Louis. Reports from these talks describe maps pinned to wooden boards and chalk marks, indicating latitudes rather than entrances. No guards were mentioned, no barriers were described. The emphasis remained on geometry and the limits of known exploration. During the same period, European explorers were returning from polar voyages with incomplete charts and fragmented observations. The journals of William Edward Parry, who led British expeditions to the Arctic between 1819 and 1825, include repeated references to unusual ice formations and temperature inconsistencies near high latitudes. These notes were factual and measured. Parry did not speculate on causes beyond ocean currents and atmospheric conditions. Later readers would attach meaning to these passages, though the original entries remain neutral. By the mid-19th century, interest in the Earth's interior expanded alongside advances in geology. In 1864, the French writer Louis Jacoliot published accounts of travels in India and the South Pacific, referencing ancient texts that described subterranean realms. His work cited Sanskrit sources such as the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, where underground cities were mentioned in passing. Jacoliot did not interpret these passages as literal geography. He treated them as cultural artifacts recorded by earlier civilizations. In 1871, the British Geological Survey released updated models of Earth's structure based on seismic studies and mineral sampling. These reports were technical and conservative. They reinforced the view of a solid crust and molten interior. No allowances were made for habitable spaces below the surface. Still, within the margins of these publications, private correspondence between surveyors discussed anomalies in borehole temperatures and unexplained voids encountered during mining operations in Cornwall and Saxony. These letters were archived without comment. Toward the end of the 19th century, interest shifted briefly to the Antarctic. The Belgica expedition of 1897-1899, led by Adrien de Gerlache, produced detailed meteorological records. Among them were notes by Frederick Cook, the ship's surgeon, describing prolonged periods of clear air and unexpected wildlife sightings near the Antarctic Circle. The entries were written in plain language, intended for medical and navigational records. Later interpretations would focus on these details, though at the time they prompted no official inquiry. The early 20th century brought further institutional attention to polar regions. In 1909, Roald Amundsen reached the South Pole and published his findings with precise coordinates and daily logs. His accounts emphasized logistics, supplies, and human endurance. They included no references to openings or internal passages. The absence itself became notable only in later decades, when readers contrasted his silence with earlier speculative writings. In 1926, the American aviator Richard E. Byrd conducted flights over the Arctic. His official reports, filed with the US Navy, documented distances, fuel consumption, and weather conditions. A diary entry attributed to Byrd, dated the 19th of February 1947, would later circulate describing land beyond the pole. The authenticity of this entry remains disputed. The version held by Ohio State University, which maintains Byrd's official papers, does not contain such descriptions. The discrepancy is documented in archival finding aids rather than resolved. Throughout this period, references to guarded boundaries appear only indirectly. In 1932, the German geographer Karl Haushofer published essays on geopolitics that included brief mentions of restricted zones in polar regions. These zones were described in administrative terms, linked to military navigation limits and weather hazards. No reference was made to subterranean access. The language used was consistent with the security concerns of the interwar years. During the Second World War, both the Allies and Axis powers increased their presence in the Arctic. Declassified German naval logs from U-boat patrols in 1942 record navigational warnings issued near certain latitudes due to magnetic irregularities. Similar warnings appear in U.S. Navy hydrographic bulletins from 1943. These notices were procedural. They advised caution and rerouting rather than exclusion. The records list coordinates but provide no rationale beyond instrumentation reliability. In 1958, the International Geophysical Year brought coordinated scientific efforts to study Earth's poles and interior. Seismographs, ice cores, and magnetometers were deployed across Antarctica and Greenland. The published results focused on tectonic plates and climate patterns. Internal memoranda between research stations, later released under Freedom of Information laws, mention access restrictions around certain drill sites due to structural instability. These restrictions were temporary and technical in nature. Parallel to official research, cultural references continued to appear. In 1969, the Soviet journal Technika Molodezhi published an article discussing hollow Earth theories as historical curiosities. The article cited earlier explorers and concluded with standard geological explanations. The editorial tone was dismissive but methodical. It did not engage with the idea of guardians or protective forces. By the late 20th century, the concept of Agartha was primarily found in esoteric literature rather than scientific journals. Authors such as René Guénon referenced it in discussions of symbolic geography. These works drew on Tibetan and Central Asian myths, particularly the legend of Shambhala. In Tibetan texts, Shambhala is described as a hidden kingdom, protected by natural barriers and spiritual discipline. Translations by scholars like Edwin Birnbaum emphasize metaphor over location. Despite this shift towards symbolism, certain administrative practices persisted. Modern satellite imagery providers classify sections of polar regions with reduced resolution, citing national security and data quality concerns. Notices from agencies such as the US Geological Survey and the European Space Agency outline these limitations in technical language. The policies are public and procedural. Across 2 centuries of records, mentions of boundaries, restrictions, and unexplained features appear sporadically. They are recorded in logs, letters, and administrative notices without emphasis. No single document asserts the presence of guards or defences. The accumulation of small, restrained entries forms a quiet archive. Each item stands on its own, neither confirming nor denying broader interpretations. Cartographers, expeditions, and lines that stop short. From the earliest surviving world maps, the edges of the known world were treated with caution. Medieval mappa mundi placed symbolic oceans or marginal notes where information failed. When systematic cartography emerged in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries, this habit did not disappear. It was formalized. Unknown areas were left blank, shaded lightly, or marked with restrained annotations. The absence of detail was considered preferable to conjecture. The Dutch cartographic tradition provides a clear example. Willem Blauw, and later his son Joan Blauw, produced atlases that were widely regarded as authoritative. In their Arctic depictions, coastlines curve confidently along known seas and then end without explanation. Latitude lines continue, but land does not. The polar centre is often occupied by decorative elements or left empty altogether. In the accompanying texts, the reason is stated plainly. Observations were incomplete. The engravers were instructed not to invent terrain. This approach reflected institutional discipline rather than uncertainty of belief. The Blauw workshop relied on ship logs, port records, and astronomical measurements. Where these sources conflicted or ceased, the map stopped. The edges were not framed as mysteries. They were treated as limits of verification. 18th century naval powers adopted similar standards. The British Admiralty's Hydrographic Office, formally established in 1795, issued charts that distinguish between surveyed and unsurveyed areas. Solid lines indicated confirmed coastlines. Dashed lines indicated features reported but not verified. Blank space indicated no data at all. These conventions were codified in chart manuals distributed to surveyors and engravers. Arctic regions consistently fell into the last category. The Admiralty charts covering Baffin Bay, published in revised editions between 1776 and 1810, show a dense network of soundings and coastlines along known passages. Beyond certain latitudes, the map surface becomes uniform. The legend does not speculate, it simply notes that no soundings were taken beyond that point due to ice conditions. The logs of Constantine John Phipps illustrate how these gaps arose. His 1773 expedition recorded daily temperatures, wind direction, and ice thickness. When progress stopped, measurements stopped as well. His published narrative explains that further advance was impossible without risking the ship. The charts derived from his voyage reflect this decision precisely. The coastline is drawn to the last measured coordinate and then ends. French cartographers followed the same practice. The Dépôt de la Marine issued polar charts based on expeditions led by Jean-François de Galaup, Comte de la Pérouse, and later by Jules Dumont d'Urville. In each case, the cartographic output mirrors the expedition's reach. Where ships turn back, lines end. Marginal notes cite ice fields, weather, or lack of visibility. The tone remains procedural. By the 19th century, geological science introduced new mapping priorities. National surveys sought to document mineral resources, fault lines, and stratigraphy. In continental interiors, this led to increasingly dense maps. In polar regions, however, these methods were difficult to apply. Rock exposures were limited. Ice cover obscured formations. As a result, geological maps of Greenland and Antarctica from this period show broad areas labelled simply as ice sheet. The British Geological Survey's internal correspondence from the 1860 discusses whether to include hypothetical bedrock contours beneath ice. The decision, recorded in meeting minutes, was not to do so. Without direct sampling, such contours would be speculative. The published maps therefore show uniform ice coverage, with no attempt to infer what lay beneath. Mining operations provided a contrasting case. In regions such as Siberia and northern Canada, exploratory shafts sometimes encountered voids or unexpected cavities. Reports from these operations were logged in technical bulletins rather than maps. When cartographers updated regional maps, they did not mark these voids unless they affected surface stability. Subsurface features were considered outside the map's scope. The late 19th century brought renewed attention to polar mapping through national prestige projects. Adolf Erik Nordenskjöld's Northeast Passage expedition generated extensive cartographic material. His team measured coastlines, depths, and magnetic variation. The resulting maps are meticulous where data exists. Near the pole, however, the same pattern persists. Lines narrow, detail fades, and annotations explain that ice conditions prevented closer approach. Nordenskjöld's personal notebooks, preserved in Stockholm, show sketches of ice formations and provisional outlines that were never transferred to final maps. Editorial notes indicate that these sketches were considered insufficiently reliable. The published atlas reflects only confirmed measurements. As mapping shifted from sail to steam, the underlying principles remained unchanged. Steam-powered icebreakers extended reach but did not eliminate uncertainty. Russian imperial charts of the Kara Sea from the 1890 show expanded coverage along shipping routes and minimal detail elsewhere. The purpose of the map dictated its content. Economic corridors were mapped thoroughly, peripheral regions were left blank. The introduction of aviation altered the geometry of maps but not their restraint. Early aerial surveys provided oblique photographs that required interpretation. In polar regions, low sun angles produced long shadows that obscured features. Photogrammetrists working for the US Army Air Service in 1921 noted that certain frames could not be rectified accurately. Their solution was omission. Maps derived from these surveys include gaps where images could not be aligned. Internal reports explain this choice in technical terms. Distortion exceeded acceptable thresholds. Rather than risk misrepresentation, cartographers left areas unmarked. The decision was documented and archived. During the interwar period, geopolitical considerations increased interest in polar regions. Germany, the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States all commissioned new maps. Some editions were classified. These maps often included shaded zones indicating navigational hazards or restricted access. In most cases, the restrictions referred to ice forecasts, military exercises, or radio silence requirements. German naval charts from 1939, later declassified, show caution zones marked near certain Arctic latitudes. The accompanying notes cite magnetic anomalies that affected compass readings. Similar notes appear in British Admiralty notices to mariners from the same year. The language is consistent and technical. There is no indication of concealed terrain. Soviet cartography offers extensive archival material. The main administration of the Northern Sea Route produced maps that combined hydrographic data with logistical planning. These maps emphasize shipping lanes, fuel depots, and weather stations. Large interior areas are shown without detail. Editorial guidelines preserved in Moscow instruct mapmakers to focus on practical navigation needs. Unused regions were deprioritized. After 1945, international scientific cooperation expanded mapping efforts. The International Geophysical Year coordinated data collection across continents. Polar regions were central to this initiative. Seismic stations, gravimetric surveys, and ice-penetrating radar were deployed. The resulting datasets were processed by different agencies and translated into maps. These maps reveal another kind of boundary. Instrument coverage defines map coverage. Where seismographs were absent, data fields end. Where radar penetration was insufficient, subsurface maps fade to uniform shading. Technical reports explain these limitations carefully. The maps do not extrapolate beyond measured ranges. The adoption of global projection systems introduced further constraints. Standard map grids distort near the poles. Cartographic manuals published by the US Army Map Service in the 1950 address this problem directly. They recommend truncating map extents before distortion compromises scale. This guidance was followed. Polar maps often stop short of the geographic pole, replacing it with inset diagrams or notes. Satellite mapping did not immediately resolve these issues. Early satellites followed inclined orbits that missed small polar caps. Landsat coverage diagrams from the 1970 show circular gaps centered on the poles. The documentation attributes these gaps to orbital design. Engineers noted that achieving full polar coverage would require different launch parameters. As satellite technology improved, coverage increased. Yet even modern datasets include areas of reduced resolution. Low sun angles, seasonal darkness, and surface reflectivity affect sensor performance. Data processing pipelines filter unreliable pixels. The filtered regions appear smooth or blank in final products. Commercial mapping platforms adopt similar practices. Technical white papers explain how polar data is generalized to maintain consistency. Users are informed that detail varies by latitude. The explanation is procedural, not interpretive. Legal frameworks also influence map content. The Antarctic Treaty prohibits military activity and freezes territorial claims. Maps produced under treaty auspices avoid national borders and sensitive infrastructure. Research stations are marked, but interior regions are often shown without detail. The omission reflects legal neutrality rather than concealment. In digital cartography, access controls add another layer. Some datasets are available only to authorized users due to national security or environmental protection policies. Public versions display reduced detail. Agency notices explain these differences in standardized language. Across centuries and technologies, the same principle governs cartographic practice. Maps depict what is measured and omit what is not. Lines stop where observation stops. Shading replaces detail where instruments fail. Annotations explain limitations without elaboration. The resulting documents are quiet records of reach and restraint, stations, patrols, and administrative presence. Permanent human presence in the polar regions developed slowly and unevenly. For much of the 19th century, expeditions were temporary by design. Crews arrived, recorded observations, and departed as seasons changed. Infrastructure was minimal. Shelters were dismantled or abandoned. No continuous oversight existed. This pattern began to shift in the early 20th century as scientific priorities and geopolitical interests converged. One of the earliest examples of sustained presence appeared in the Arctic. In 1882, the first International Polar Year established a network of observation stations across high latitudes. These stations, operated by different national teams, focused on meteorology, magnetism, and auroral activity. Their locations were selected for accessibility rather than remoteness. Administrative records from the period describe supply routes, staffing rotations, and reporting schedules. Security considerations were not mentioned. By the 1920s, radio communication allowed stations to remain in contact year-round. The Norwegian government maintained weather stations along Svalbard, staffed by small crews who rotated every 12 months. Their logs, preserved in Oslo, detailed daily routines. Equipment maintenance, data transmission, and food storage occupied most entries. Occasional references to patrol visits appear, usually related to mail delivery or medical checks. In Antarctica, permanent presence began later. The first year-round station, Little America 1, was established by the United States during the Byrd Antarctic Expedition of 1928-1930. The station consisted of prefabricated structures buried in snow for insulation. Administrative correspondence focuses on fuel consumption, personnel health, and coordination with support ships. There is no reference to territorial control or restricted access beyond immediate safety zones. The Second World War accelerated polar activity indirectly. Arctic routes gained importance for shipping and weather forecasting. Allied and Axis powers established temporary installations to monitor conditions. German weather stations in Greenland and Franz Josef Land operated covertly but followed standard meteorological protocols. Their mission reports, recovered after the war, emphasized data collection and radio transmission. Security measures were limited to camouflage and secrecy, rather than physical barriers. Following the war, the strategic value of polar regions increased. The Cold War introduced new forms of administrative presence. The United States and Canada constructed the Distant Early Warning Line across the Arctic in the 1950s. These radar stations were linked by supply chains and patrol schedules. Personnel were civilian contractors and military technicians. Access was controlled through permits and transport coordination. Declassified planning documents describe these controls as logistical necessities rather than defensive measures. Antarctica experienced a parallel expansion through scientific cooperation. The International Geophysical Year of 1957-1958 led to the establishment of numerous research stations. McMurdo Station, established by the United States, became a logistical hub. Soviet, British, Australian, and Argentine stations followed. Each operated under national administration while adhering to shared scientific protocols. The Antarctic Treaty, signed in 1959, formalized this arrangement. It prohibited military activity and emphasized peaceful research. Administrative guidelines attached to the treaty specify inspection rights. Any signatory nation may visit another's station to verify compliance. Inspection reports from the 1,960 detail station layouts, fuel storage, and living conditions. They do not describe guarded perimeters. Security was limited to locking equipment sheds and maintaining radio schedules. Routine patrols in Antarctica are primarily logistical. Vehicles move between stations to transport supplies, fuel, and personnel. Flight paths are coordinated through shared air traffic control centers. The Council of Managers of National Antarctic Programs publishes guidelines on movement and access. These documents focus on environmental protection and safety. Restricted zones are designated around wildlife colonies and hazardous terrain. In the Arctic, administrative presence varies by nation. Russia maintains a network of bases along its northern coast, some of which are staffed year-round. Official statements describe these bases as search and rescue and navigation support facilities. Satellite imagery confirms infrastructure, such as runways and radar arrays. Access to these sites is regulated through national law. Publicly available regulations outline permit requirements for foreign vessels and aircraft. Canada enforces similar controls in its Arctic archipelago. The Canadian Rangers conduct patrols across remote areas using snowmobiles and small boats. Their role, as defined in military doctrine, is observation and assistance rather than enforcement. Patrol reports emphasize visibility and presence. Encounters with civilians are rare and typically involve researchers or indigenous hunters. The United States maintains limited permanent facilities in the Arctic, relying instead on seasonal deployments. Administrative oversight is handled through agencies such as the National Science Foundation and the Coast Guard. Permits are required for research expeditions. Application forms specify routes, equipment, and emergency plans. Approval is based on safety and environmental impact. Across both poles, airspace management constitutes another layer of oversight. Flight corridors are established to support research and resupply missions. Notices to airmen list restricted areas due to weather, terrain, or operational activity. These notices are updated regularly and distributed through international aviation channels. The language used is standardized and technical. Maritime access is similarly regulated. Icebreaker schedules are published months in advance. Vessels operating in polar waters must meet construction standards and carry specific equipment. The International Maritime Organization's Polar Code outlines these requirements. Enforcement is carried out through port state control and flag state oversight rather than on-site interdiction. Environmental protection adds further administrative boundaries. Protected areas are designated around historical sites, research zones, and sensitive ecosystems. Entry into these areas requires special authorization. Maps showing these zones are publicly available. The restrictions are described in environmental management plans rather than security directives. Digital monitoring supplements physical presence. Satellites track ship movements and ice conditions. Automatic identification system. Data is collected and shared among agencies. This monitoring is passive. It does not involve interception unless regulations are violated. Annual reports summarize compliance trends without naming specific incidents. Archival material reveals how these systems function in practice. Incident reports typically involve mechanical failures, medical evacuations, or weather delays. Responses are coordinated through established channels. There is little evidence of confrontations or exclusions beyond administrative refusals of permits. Occasionally, access is denied due to incomplete documentation or safety concerns. Such decisions are recorded in correspondence between agencies and applicants. The reasons cited are consistent: insufficient experience, inadequate equipment, or environmental risk. Appeals are processed through formal review. Over time, administrative presence has become normalized. Stations operate on schedules, patrols follow routes, permits are issued and reviewed. The systems emphasize predictability and coordination. They rely on paperwork, communication, and routine oversight rather than physical force. In official records, the language remains consistent across decades. Terms such as restricted, controlled, and limited access appear frequently. They are defined in context and tied to specific regulations. There is no separate category for hidden or unacknowledged zones. The cumulative effect of these practices is a managed environment. Human activity is organized, recorded, and monitored. Boundaries exist, but they are described in administrative terms. The presence of oversight is evident, though its purpose is framed as operational rather than protective. Permits, clearances, and quiet denials. Access to polar regions is governed less by physical barriers than by documentation. From the early 20th century onward, formal permission became the primary mechanism through which movement was regulated. These systems developed gradually, shaped by logistical realities and later standardized through international agreements. The resulting paper trails are extensive, procedural, and largely public. In the Arctic, permit systems emerged alongside increased scientific and commercial activity. By the 1920s, governments with northern territories began requiring notification for expeditions. Norway, which administered Svalbard after the 1920 Svalbard Treaty, introduced a registration process for foreign researchers. Archival forms from this period request basic information: names, dates, routes, and objectives. Approval was typically granted unless the expedition posed a clear safety risk. Similar practices appeared in Greenland under Danish administration. In 1930, the Danish government required permits for scientific work beyond coastal settlements. The stated purpose was coordination rather than restriction. Correspondence between applicants and officials shows a routine exchange of letters, maps, and schedules. Delays were common, usually attributed to seasonal planning or incomplete information. After the Second World War, permit systems expanded in scope and detail. The growth of aviation and mechanized transport increased the potential impact of expeditions. Governments responded by formalizing requirements. In Canada, the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act of 1970 introduced environmental considerations into access decisions. Permit applications began to include fuel management plans and waste disposal methods. Rejections were justified in technical terms. Antarctica developed a distinct framework. The Antarctic Treaty did not prohibit access but required that activities be reported in advance. Each signatory nation established a national authority to review proposed expeditions. Applications included personnel lists, equipment inventories, and emergency procedures. These documents were exchanged among treaty parties to ensure transparency. Inspection reports from the 1960 and 1970 indicate that most applications were approved. When issues arose, they were addressed through requests for revision rather than outright refusal. The language used in these exchanges is consistent and restrained. Phrases such as clarification required and additional information requested appear frequently. Quiet denials do occur, though they are rarely framed as such. In many cases, applications lapse without formal rejection. Archival records from the British Antarctic Survey show proposals marked as not progressed. Internal notes cite reasons such as insufficient funding, lack of logistical support, or overlap with existing projects. Applicants were informed that resubmission was possible. In the Arctic, similar outcomes appear in US Coast Guard records. Requests for vessel transit through certain passages were sometimes delayed beyond the operational window. The official explanation cited ice forecasts or search and rescue limitations. The result was effective denial without explicit refusal. These decisions were documented, but not emphasized. The Soviet Union maintained its own permit system for Arctic access. Foreign expeditions required approval from multiple agencies, including the Academy of Sciences and the Ministry of Transport. Declassified files from the 1980 show that approvals were selective. Reasons for denial included security concerns and resource constraints. The correspondence remains formal and concise. Modern permit systems are more standardized, but retain the same character. Digital application portals used by agencies such as the National Science Foundation and the Norwegian Polar Institute list detailed requirements. Applicants must demonstrate experience, funding, and contingency planning. Automated acknowledgements replace letters, but the evaluation criteria remain similar. Environmental protection has become a central factor. Protected areas, known as Antarctic Specially Protected Areas, require additional authorization. Management plans for these zones specify allowable activities. Applications that do not align with these plans are returned with explanations referencing specific clauses. The tone remains administrative. Airspace access introduces another layer. Overflights of polar regions require coordination with aviation authorities. Flight plans are reviewed for safety and environmental impact. Notices of disapproval are issued when criteria are not met. These notices reference regulations rather than broader considerations. Maritime access is governed through international conventions. Vessels must comply with the Polar Code, which sets standards for construction and operation. Port state control inspections verify compliance before departure. Failure to meet standards results in detention until deficiencies are corrected. Records of these actions are maintained in maritime databases. Cases involving individuals rather than expeditions follow the same pattern. Solo travelers seeking to reach extreme latitudes often encounter administrative obstacles. Media accounts describe applications that were delayed or redirected. Official statements emphasize safety and liability. The underlying process is documented through emails and forms. Occasionally, disputes arise. In 1996, a private expedition challenged a permit denial in a national court, arguing that access restrictions exceeded statutory authority. The court upheld the agency's decision, citing its mandate to assess risk. The ruling focused on procedural compliance rather than the destination itself. International oversight adds further review. Under the Antarctic Treaty, proposed activities are shared among consultative parties. Objections may be raised if environmental impact assessments are deemed insufficient. These objections are recorded in meeting minutes. Resolution typically involves modification rather than prohibition. Across jurisdictions, the language of denial is indirect. Terms such as "not approved at this time" and "pending further review" are preferred. This reflects administrative culture rather than secrecy. The emphasis is on process continuity. Records show that access is more often limited by logistics than by policy. Weather windows, transport availability, and funding cycles constrain movement. Permit systems formalize these constraints. The resulting denials appear quiet because they align with operational realities. Over decades, these systems have produced extensive archives. Applications, approvals, and refusals are filed and preserved. Researchers examining these files encounter consistency rather than anomaly. Decisions reference regulations, guidelines, and capacity. The absence of dramatic language is notable. Even when access is restricted, explanations remain technical. There is no separate vocabulary for exceptional zones. All areas are treated within the same framework. Permits function as interfaces between intent and feasibility. They translate plans into approved movements or deferred proposals. Clearances mark readiness. Denials, when they occur, are recorded as procedural outcomes. In this administrative landscape, boundaries are enforced through paperwork. Movement depends on compliance. The system operates quietly, with minimal public attention. Its effects are cumulative and documented. Scientific anomalies logged without emphasis. Scientific work in polar regions produces large volumes of raw data. Most of it conforms to expectations. Temperature curves follow seasonal patterns. Magnetic readings fluctuate within known ranges. Ice cores show layered accumulation consistent with climate models. When results fall outside predicted values, they are recorded in the same format as everything else. The difference is numerical, not rhetorical. During the first International Polar Year in 1882, observatories across the Arctic recorded synchronized measurements of magnetism and auroras. Daily logs from stations in Fort Ray, Point Barrow, and Jan Mayen Island show occasional deviations from predicted magnetic declination. These were entered as figures with brief notes such as "instrument irregular" or "cause unknown." No additional commentary appears. The logs move on to the next entry. Similar patterns appear in early Antarctic research. The British Discovery Expedition of 1901-1904 maintained meticulous meteorological records. On several occasions, barometric pressure readings shifted abruptly without corresponding weather changes. The expedition's chief scientist, George Murray, noted the discrepancy in the margin of a data table. The published report includes the values without interpretation. Later summaries omit the note entirely. Seismic research introduced new forms of anomaly. In 1914, German geophysicist Emil Wiechert proposed methods for detecting Earth's internal layers through wave propagation. When seismic stations were later installed in polar regions, some wave paths behaved differently than models predicted. Reports from Greenland stations in the 1930s show delayed arrivals of certain wave types. These delays were flagged for review but not highlighted in conclusions. The International Geophysical Year intensified this pattern. Thousands of instruments operated simultaneously across Antarctica and the Arctic. The volume of data required standardized processing. Analysts focused on averages and trends. Outliers were catalogued but rarely discussed at length. Internal memos from the US. Antarctic Research Program mentioned localized irregularities in gravimetric readings near certain inland stations. The term appears without elaboration. Ice-penetrating radar, introduced in the 1960s, generated additional anomalies. Radar profiles from East Antarctica sometimes revealed flat subsurface reflections, inconsistent with surrounding terrain. These reflections were labeled with neutral codes in data catalogues. Technical reports explain that signal interpretation can be affected by ice chemistry and temperature. No further assessment is included. Magnetic surveys present similar cases. Aeromagnetic flights conducted by the Australian Antarctic Division in the 1970s produced maps showing regions of low magnetic intensity. These zones were outlined and assigned reference numbers. The explanatory text attributes them to crustal composition. Where data was insufficient, the maps note uncertainty rather than propose causes. Thermal measurements occasionally diverge from expected gradients. Boreholes drilled during Soviet Antarctic expeditions recorded temperature profiles that flattened at certain depths. The results were published in Russian-language journals with accompanying graphs. Commentary was limited to methodological considerations. The authors noted the need for further drilling to confirm results. Biological surveys also recorded unexpected findings. During a 1958 traverse, US researchers reported microbial activity in ice layers deeper than anticipated. The observation was logged and samples were archived. The official report lists the finding among many others, without emphasis. Follow-up studies were proposed but not immediately funded. In the Arctic, oceanographic measurements sometimes revealed warm water layers beneath colder surface ice. Norwegian surveys in the Fram Strait documented these layers in the 1980s. The phenomenon was attributed to known currents. Where temperature profiles deviated from models, the data was retained with caveats. The reports maintain a descriptive tone. Satellite observations added a new dimension. Infrared imagery occasionally showed localized heat signatures beneath ice sheets. Early Landsat analysts flagged these pixels as potential sensor artifacts. Technical notes recommend cautious interpretation. Subsequent images sometimes reproduced the same signatures, but the classification remained provisional. Atmospheric studies produced their own irregularities. Ozone measurements over Antarctica in the 1980s revealed unexpected depletion. Initial readings were questioned due to instrument calibration. Only after repeated confirmation did the anomaly gain prominence. Before that point, the data existed quietly in spreadsheets and charts. Not all anomalies lead to revision. Many remain isolated entries. A 1994 US Geological Survey report lists unexplained seismic noise recorded at a remote Greenland station. The noise was low amplitude and intermittent. The report includes the data and notes that no source was identified. No follow-up section is provided. Archival practices ensure that such data is preserved. Raw measurements are stored alongside metadata describing conditions and instrumentation. Access logs show that many datasets are rarely revisited. Their presence in archives does not imply significance. They remain available for future analysis. Peer review reinforces restraint. Scientific journals prioritize reproducibility and statistical weight. Single-site anomalies rarely meet publication thresholds. When they do appear, they are framed as preliminary. Language such as "requires further study" is standard. The tone remains measured. In institutional summaries, anomalies are often absorbed into broader datasets. Averages smooth deviations, graphs compress variation. Unless patterns emerge, irregular points lose visibility. This is not concealment but normalization. Occasionally, anomalies resurface decades later. Improved models or new theories prompt re-examination of old data. The original records gain context retroactively. Until then, they remain quiet entries. Across disciplines, the handling of anomalies follows the same pattern: measure, record, archive. Interpret cautiously or not at all. The process values continuity over speculation. The cumulative archive contains many such entries. They are scattered across reports, tables, and appendices. No single anomaly stands alone. Each is embedded in routine documentation. The scientific record, taken as a whole, reflects this discipline. Irregularities are acknowledged but not elevated without cause. The absence of emphasis is deliberate. It preserves the integrity of observation. Accounts, set aside as misreported or unverified. Throughout the history of polar exploration and observation, a steady number of reports have been recorded and then quietly reclassified as errors. These accounts originate from varied sources. Some come from trained explorers, others are submitted by pilots, radio operators, or civilian travelers. What unites them is not their content, but how institutions responded to them. In the 19th century, expedition leaders routinely filtered observations before publication. Ship logs often contained remarks that did not appear in official narratives. The journals of Elisha Kent Kane, who led US Arctic expeditions in the 1850s, include marginal notes describing distant landforms that could not be triangulated. When Kane's official report was published, these descriptions were omitted. Editorial correspondence indicates that features lacking fixed coordinates were excluded to avoid confusion. Naval hydrographic offices followed similar practices. Sightings reported by individual officers were compared against existing charts. If no corroborating observation existed, the sighting was labelled uncertain. Admiralty files from 1874 include a report of land observed north of Franz Joseph Land. The follow-up assessment attributes the sighting to atmospheric refraction. The case file was closed without revision to maps. Mirage phenomena account for many such dismissals. In polar regions, temperature gradients can distort light. Known effects such as fata morgana can elevate distant ice or landforms above the horizon. Explorers including Fridtjof Nansen documented these effects in detail. When later reports matched known mirage patterns, they were classified accordingly. The classification required no further action. Aviation introduced new categories of unverified accounts. Early polar flights relied on visual navigation supplemented by rudimentary instruments. Pilots sometimes reported terrain inconsistent with maps. In 1929, an Italian aircrew flying over the Arctic noted what appeared to be a river system beneath the ice. The flight report was reviewed by cartographers, who concluded that shadowing and surface melt patterns produced the illusion. The observation was archived as misinterpretation. Military aviation logs show similar patterns. During the Second World War, bomber crews flying polar routes occasionally reported unexpected landmasses. Intelligence officers cross-referenced these reports with existing charts and satellite-free reconnaissance. In most cases, the explanations cited cloud formations or instrument error. The reports were retained but marked not substantiated. Post-war records reflect increased standardization. The U.S. Air Force's Air Weather Service required anomaly reports to include instrument calibration data. If calibration could not be verified, the report was downgraded. Files from the 1950 show multiple instances where radar returns suggested terrain beyond known coastlines. Technical analysis attributed these returns to ionospheric interference. The cases were closed. Civilian reports followed a similar trajectory. In the 1960 and 1970, amateur pilots and sailors submitted accounts of unusual conditions near polar regions. National mapping agencies logged these submissions. Standard response letters thanked the informant and noted that no confirmation was possible. The correspondence was filed. No public statements were issued. Media occasionally amplified such accounts. Newspaper articles sometimes described new lands or hidden valleys reported by individuals. Government agencies responded with brief clarifications. Press releases emphasized known phenomena and reaffirmed existing maps. Afterward, the matter was not revisited. Scientific institutions applied comparable filters. Researchers encountering anomalous readings were required to assess instrument reliability. If a single dataset diverged without replication, it was flagged as noise. Peer reviewers reinforced this standard. Papers proposing interpretations based on unverified observations were rejected or returned for revision. Archives preserve these processes in detail. Case files include initial reports, internal evaluations, and final classifications. The language used is consistent. Terms such as unconfirmed, likely artifact, and insufficient evidence appear repeatedly. Once assigned, these labels effectively end inquiry. The Soviet Union maintained parallel systems. Reports from Arctic pilots and station personnel were reviewed by scientific committees. Declassified files show that unusual observations were often attributed to equipment malfunction. The committees documented their reasoning and closed cases. The records remain accessible in state archives. In some instances, reassessment occurs decades later. Advances in technology prompt review of older data. Yet even when re-examined, most accounts remain unresolved rather than validated. The original classification persists unless new evidence emerges. The handling of unverified accounts reflects institutional priorities. Accuracy and consistency outweigh novelty. The threshold for revision is high. Single observations rarely alter established records. This process does not imply dismissal of observers. Most response letters acknowledge the report's receipt and effort. The tone remains respectful. What is absent is endorsement. The system favors caution. Over time, the accumulation of such cases forms a background layer of documentation. They exist within archives without prominence. Researchers encounter them incidentally rather than as focal points. The absence of follow-up often leads to speculation outside institutional channels. Within official systems, however, the matter is considered settled once classified. No additional resources are allocated. This pattern repeats across centuries and technologies. From ship logs to satellite feeds, the treatment of unverified accounts remains stable. Observation alone is insufficient. Verification governs inclusion. The result is a curated record shaped by standards rather than curiosity. What cannot be confirmed is set aside. The process is procedural and quiet, cultural narratives that persist outside official records. Alongside formal documentation, a parallel body of material has existed for centuries. It does not appear in government archives or scientific journals. It is preserved through oral transmission, religious texts, and regional literature. These narratives often reference hidden places beneath mountains, within the earth, or beyond ordinary routes of travel. Their persistence does not depend on verification, it depends on continuity. In Central Asia, references to an underground realm appear in Tibetan and Mongolian traditions. Texts associated with the Kalachakra Tantra, dated by scholars to the 10th or 11th century, describe a concealed kingdom known as Shambhala. The descriptions focus on moral order, cycles of time, and spiritual governance. Geographic detail is minimal. Locations are implied rather than mapped. Monastic commentaries emphasize that the kingdom is inaccessible by ordinary means. Chinese historical literature includes similar motifs. Records from the Tang dynasty reference hidden valleys inhabited by long-lived figures. These accounts appear in collections such as the Taiping Guangji, compiled in the 10th century. The entries are brief and anecdotal. They are presented as curiosities rather than doctrine. No attempt is made to reconcile them with imperial geography. In India, ancient epics contain references to subterranean cities. The Mahabharata and the Puranas mention realms known as Patala and Nagaloka. These locations are associated with serpentine beings and advanced architecture. Sanskrit scholars note that such passages serve cosmological functions. They describe layered worlds rather than physical strata. The texts do not specify entrances or routes. Islamic literature preserves comparable ideas. Medieval geographers such as Al-Qazwini wrote of hidden lands beyond known seas and deserts. His work, The Wonders of Creation, compiled in the 13th century, includes accounts of enclosed regions guarded by natural barriers. These descriptions are symbolic. They coexist with otherwise empirical observations of climate and terrain. European folklore reflects the same pattern. Legends of subterranean kingdoms appear in Celtic traditions. Irish texts refer to the Sidhe, beings associated with mounds and underground halls. These stories were transmitted orally before being recorded in medieval manuscripts. The narratives emphasize separation rather than access. The other world exists alongside the visible world but remains distinct. In Scandinavia, Norse sagas describe realms beneath the earth, such as Svartalfheim. These locations are part of a mythic cosmology. They are not tied to specific coordinates. The sagas do not attempt to integrate these realms into navigational knowledge. South American traditions also contain references to hidden interiors. In Andean cultures, oral histories speak of underground passages connecting sacred sites. Spanish chroniclers recorded these accounts in the 16th century. The chroniclers often express skepticism but preserve the narratives verbatim. The passages are described as ceremonial rather than exploratory. Across Africa, similar motifs appear. Ethiopian texts reference concealed places associated with divine protection. In West African oral traditions, certain mountains and caves are described as thresholds rather than destinations. Access is restricted by custom and ritual. These restrictions are social, not enforced by physical means. What distinguishes these narratives is their independence from administrative systems. They are not regulated by permits or inspections. Their authority derives from tradition. As a result, they persist even when official records remain silent. In the 19th century, European writers began to synthesize these traditions. Authors such as Helena Blavatsky drew on Asian and European sources to propose unified interpretations. Her writings reference hidden centers of knowledge beneath the earth. Scholars note that Blavatsky relied heavily on secondary sources and symbolic readings. Her work influenced later esoteric movements but remained outside academic discourse. René Guénon, writing in the early 20th century, treated such narratives as expressions of metaphysical principles. He argued that hidden kingdoms represented centers of tradition rather than physical places. His essays cite Islamic, Hindu, and Buddhist sources. Guénon's language is abstract. He avoids geographic claims. Despite these interpretations, popular culture often literalized the narratives. Adventure novels published between 1880 and 1930 depicted underground civilizations accessed through polar openings or remote caves. These works were explicitly fictional. Publishers marketed them as entertainment. The authors did not claim documentary authority. Oral traditions continued alongside these developments. Anthropological fieldwork conducted in the mid-20th century recorded local accounts of forbidden regions. Researchers noted that such regions were often associated with environmental hazards. Glaciers, unstable terrain, and extreme weather provided practical reasons for avoidance. The narratives encoded caution rather than concealment. Transmission methods reinforce stability. Oral accounts are repeated within communities using consistent phrasing. Deviations are corrected through retelling. Written texts are copied and commented upon. The core elements remain unchanged even as contexts shift. Modern researchers encounter these narratives through translation and ethnography. Academic treatment separates symbolic meaning from physical interpretation. The narratives are studied as cultural artifacts. Their persistence is explained through social function. Unlike official records, these accounts do not accumulate revisions. They do not issue corrections or updates. Their continuity depends on repetition rather than evidence. This allows them to persist unchanged across centuries. The coexistence of these narratives with scientific and administrative records creates parallel archives. One operates through measurement and verification. The other operates through meaning and tradition. They rarely intersect formally. When they do intersect, the result is classification. Cultural narratives are assigned to anthropology, religion, or literature. They are not evaluated as geographic claims. This categorization removes them from practical consideration. The persistence of these narratives outside official records reflects the limits of institutional documentation. Not all forms of knowledge seek verification. Some seek preservation. These accounts remain accessible through texts, rituals, and oral memory. They exist without reference to permits, maps, or patrols. Their boundaries are maintained through belief rather than enforcement. They continue to be told, recorded, and studied. Their presence is stable. Their content remains largely unchanged. Sites with restricted access and limited disclosure. Across polar and subpolar regions, certain locations are subject to access limitations that extend beyond routine permitting. These sites are identified in official documents, though descriptions are often brief. Restrictions are justified through environmental protection, safety concerns, or national jurisdiction. Information about these areas is available, but it is sparse and procedural. In Antarctica, the most formalized restrictions appear under the Antarctic Treaty System. Antarctic, specially protected areas, designated since the 1960s, are defined by management plans approved at consultative meetings. These plans specify boundaries, access conditions, and prohibited activities. Entry requires explicit authorization. Public summaries list coordinates and objectives, such as protecting scientific experiments or fragile ecosystems. Detailed site conditions are rarely included. Inspection reports confirm that these areas are marked physically with signage when practical. Where signage is impossible due to weather or terrain, boundaries are described through coordinates. The reports do not mention enforcement personnel stationed on site. Compliance relies on reporting obligations and post-visit documentation. Some protected sites are associated with historical artifacts. Huts used by early expeditions, such as those of Scott and Shackleton, are preserved as heritage sites. Access is limited to prevent deterioration. Visitor guidelines specify footwear, movement paths, and time limits. These rules are enforced administratively through tour operator permits. Beyond treaty-designated sites, certain areas in Antarctica remain difficult to access due to logistics. Inland regions far from established stations lack infrastructure. Flight plans to these areas require special approval due to fuel range and emergency response limitations. Official responses to applications cite distance and rescue feasibility rather than secrecy. In the Arctic, restricted sites are more closely tied to national sovereignty. Russia maintains several closed administrative zones along its northern coast. These zones are governed by federal law. Entry requires clearance from security services. Public regulations outline the process, but details about internal facilities are limited. Maps often mark these areas without elaboration. Norway enforces access controls around Svalbard through environmental regulations. Large portions of the archipelago are designated nature reserves. Permits are required for travel outside settlements. The governor of Svalbard publishes guidelines that specify routes, seasonal restrictions, and equipment requirements. Some inland areas are closed during wildlife breeding periods. The closures are temporary and announced in advance. Canada applies similar measures in its high Arctic. Certain islands are classified as national wildlife areas. Entry is restricted to protect species and habitats. Applications are reviewed by environmental agencies. Denials reference statutory mandates. Public notices describe the restrictions but do not provide site-level detail. The United States restricts access to some Arctic installations through military jurisdiction. Facilities associated with radar, communications, or research are surrounded by controlled zones. These zones are marked on charts and described in legal terms. Civilian access is prohibited unless authorized. Public information focuses on safety and operational integrity. In Greenland, Denmark regulates access to former military sites. Cold War installations, some abandoned, are subject to safety restrictions due to unexploded materials and structural hazards. Notices issued by Danish authorities advise against entry. The sites are listed in public registries, but detailed layouts are not published. Airspace restrictions overlay many of these locations. Temporary flight restrictions are issued around sensitive sites. Notices to airmen specify altitudes and timeframes. The rationale provided includes interference prevention and safety. These notices are standardized and expire automatically unless renewed. Maritime restrictions follow similar patterns. Certain coastal areas are closed to navigation during military exercises or environmental monitoring. Notices to mariners describe exclusion zones using coordinates. The reasons given are operational. The restrictions are lifted once activities conclude. Satellite imagery providers sometimes limit resolution over specific sites. Companies cite national regulations and licensing requirements. Public statements explain that data is withheld to comply with law. The affected areas are not identified individually. Users encounter generalized reduction in detail rather than explicit blackouts. In some cases, information is limited due to private ownership. Research consortia operating remote installations control access to protect experiments. Memoranda of Understanding outline confidentiality obligations. Summaries of projects are published, but technical specifics remain internal. Archival records show that requests for information about restricted sites are handled through formal channels. Freedom of information responses often confirm the existence of a site while withholding operational details. The exemptions cited include security and environmental protection. The language is consistent across jurisdictions. Occasionally, journalists attempt to investigate such locations. Reports describe difficulties obtaining permits or details. Official responses emphasize compliance with existing regulations. Follow-up coverage is limited when access is not granted. Academic researchers encounter similar constraints. Proposals involving restricted sites require additional review. Ethics committees and funding agencies assess risk and compliance. Decisions are documented. Rejections cite procedural shortcomings rather than content. The cumulative effect of these practices is partial visibility. The existence of sites is acknowledged. Their purpose is outlined in broad terms. Detailed information is compartmentalized. This compartmentalization is structured rather than ad hoc. Historical comparison shows continuity. Earlier eras used physical remoteness to limit access. Modern systems use regulation and documentation. The outcome is similar. Certain places remain little described in public records. The reasons given for restriction are practical. Environmental sensitivity, safety hazards, and jurisdictional control appear repeatedly. No alternative explanations are offered in official texts. These sites occupy defined spaces within polar governance. They are integrated into legal frameworks. Their boundaries are drawn on maps, though detail within those boundaries is minimal. The limited disclosure does not imply absence of record. Internally, documentation exists. Externally, summaries suffice. This separation maintains administrative order. Over time, some sites are reclassified. Restrictions may be lifted or modified. Notices reflect these changes. The process is incremental and documented. What remains consistent is the tone. Official language avoids emphasis. Restrictions are presented as routine measures. The sites exist within a system that prioritizes management over explanation. Communications, monitoring, and invisible oversight. In polar regions, oversight is rarely visible on the ground. Distances are vast, infrastructure is sparse, and permanent staffing is limited. Instead, monitoring is achieved through layered communication systems and remote sensing technologies. These systems operate continuously, often without direct human presence, and are documented primarily through technical specifications rather than narrative accounts. Radio communication formed the earliest backbone of polar oversight. By the 1920s, Arctic weather stations relied on scheduled radio transmissions to relay data. Transmission logs from Norwegian and Soviet stations show fixed reporting windows, often timed to coincide with ionospheric conditions favourable to signal propagation. Missed transmissions were noted and followed up through secondary channels. The absence of a signal prompted logistical concern rather than investigation. Antarctic stations adopted similar practices. During the first year-round occupations in the 1930s, radio was the sole link to the outside world for months at a time. Station logs record daily check-ins with supply ships or mainland offices. These communications focused on weather, health, and fuel status. Oversight consisted of knowing that a signal was sent and received. As technology advanced, communication networks expanded. High-frequency radio gave way to satellite relays in the 1960s and 1970. The introduction of the ATS and Intelsat systems allowed near-continuous contact. Technical manuals describe antenna orientation, signal latency, and redundancy protocols. Oversight improved in reliability but remained indirect. Monitoring systems developed alongside communication. Meteorological sensors, seismic stations, and magnetometers were installed across polar regions. These instruments transmitted data automatically. Central offices received streams of numbers rather than reports. Anomalies triggered flags in data processing software. Human review followed predefined criteria. Seismic monitoring illustrates this process. Global networks include stations positioned in polar locations to improve coverage. These stations record ground motion continuously. Data is transmitted to international data centers. When signals exceed thresholds, automated alerts are generated. Analysts review waveforms to classify events. The system monitors activity without reference to location context beyond coordinates. Satellite observation added another layer. Earth-observing satellites track ice movement, surface temperature, and atmospheric conditions. Polar orbiting satellites pass over high latitudes multiple times per day. Coverage maps show dense overlap near the poles. The data is processed into standardized products. Oversight occurs through trend analysis rather than individual inspection. Navigation monitoring operates similarly. Aircraft flying polar routes file flight plans that are tracked through radar and satellite-based systems. Automatic dependent surveillance. Broadcast signals transmit position data. Control centers monitor compliance with corridors and altitude restrictions. Deviations prompt radio contact. The interaction is procedural. Maritime traffic is tracked through the automatic identification system. Ships broadcast identity, position, and course. Coastal stations and satellites collect this information. Databases compile movement histories. Analysts can reconstruct routes after the fact. Real-time oversight focuses on collision avoidance and ice navigation. Environmental monitoring introduces additional oversight mechanisms. Protected areas are surveyed through remote cameras and satellite imagery. Wildlife populations are tracked through tagging and aerial counts. Data informs management decisions. Physical enforcement is rare. Compliance is inferred from absence of disturbance signals. Military monitoring integrates with civilian systems. Radar installations in the Arctic serve both defense and navigation functions. Public documentation describes their technical capabilities. Classified aspects are acknowledged but not detailed. The presence of these systems is visible in infrastructure, but their operation remains background. In Antarctica, treaty inspections include review of communication equipment. Inspection reports list antennas, transmitters, and power supplies. The focus is on transparency. Inspectors verify that stations can be contacted and that activities are reported. Oversight is achieved through mutual observation. Data centers act as hubs. Institutions such as the National Snow and Ice Data Center aggregate information from multiple sources. Access logs show frequent automated queries and infrequent manual intervention. Oversight becomes a matter of data integrity rather than territorial control. Failures are handled through protocols. When a station stops transmitting, contingency plans are activated. Backup systems are checked. If contact is not restored, rescue coordination may begin. Incident reports detail timelines. The emphasis is on restoration of communication. Historical records show that monitoring has become more comprehensive over time. Early explorers relied on periodic reports. Modern systems provide continuous streams, yet the character of oversight remains impersonal. Numbers replace narratives. Privacy considerations occasionally arise. Satellite imagery resolution limits are imposed to protect sensitive sites. Regulations specify what can be shared publicly. Monitoring continues internally. Public-facing products are generalized. Oversight also extends to research output. Data sharing agreements require submission to repositories. Compliance is monitored through publication records. Funding agencies track deliverables. The process is administrative. In practice, invisible oversight reduces the need for physical presence. Systems observe conditions and movements without confrontation. Alerts prompt responses only when thresholds are crossed. Most activity proceeds without intervention. The language used to describe these systems is technical. Terms such as coverage, latency, and redundancy dominate documentation. There is little reference to control. The framing emphasizes support and safety. Over decades, these systems have layered upon one another. Communication supports monitoring. Monitoring informs administration. Oversight becomes distributed across institutions and technologies. The result is a networked environment. Activity is known, recorded, and archived. Boundaries are maintained through signals rather than barriers. Presence is inferred through data. This form of oversight leaves minimal trace on the landscape. Antennas, sensors, and satellites operate quietly. Their function is continuous and unremarkable. The record reflects this quiet operation. Reports list uptime, percentages, and data volumes. Success is measured in continuity. Oversight in polar regions thus resides largely in infrastructure. It is invisible to most observers. It persists through routine operation. Statements of authority without named custodians. Formal authority in polar regions is expressed primarily through documents rather than personnel. Declarations, treaties, statutes, and regulations define responsibility without consistently identifying who enforces it on the ground. The language of these texts emphasizes jurisdiction, obligation, and compliance. Individual actors are rarely mentioned. Authority appears as a condition rather than an agent. Early examples can be found in 19th century claims of discovery. When explorers reached high latitudes, their governments issued proclamations asserting priority. These statements were published in official gazettes and naval records. They named sovereigns and nations, not administrators. Enforcement was assumed to follow recognition rather than presence. The Arctic offers multiple cases. In 1925, Canada issued an order in council asserting sovereignty over its Arctic archipelago. The document references latitude and longitude, but does not describe mechanisms of control. Responsibility is implied through legal language. Subsequent correspondence within the Department of the Interior discusses patrols and administration, but the proclamation itself remains abstract. Norway's sovereignty over Svalbard was established through the Svalbard Treaty of 1920. The treaty grants Norway administrative authority while guaranteeing access to other signatories. The text outlines rights and restrictions, but does not designate specific offices beyond general governance. Implementation is left to national law. The treaty functions as an assertion without detailing daily enforcement. Greenland presents a similar structure. Denmark's authority was affirmed through international recognition in the early 20th century. Legal documents define Greenland as part of the Danish realm. Administrative details appear in separate statutes. The foundational statements are concise. They identify territory and responsibility, but not custodians. In Antarctica, authority is more diffuse. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959 avoids sovereignty claims altogether. Instead, it establishes a framework of collective responsibility. Articles refer to consultative parties and designated observers. No central authority is created. Oversight exists without a singular custodian. Inspection rights under the treaty illustrate this approach. Any consultative party may inspect another's facilities. The treaty does not name inspectors or enforcement bodies. It defines the right abstractly. Reports are filed with secretariats rather than commanding offices. Environmental protocols added later follow the same pattern. The Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty outlines obligations for impact assessment and waste management. It assigns responsibility to national programs. The protocol itself remains non-specific about enforcement. Compliance is reported through paperwork. Military authority, where present, is also expressed indirectly. National defense statutes reference polar regions in terms of airspace, maritime zones, and early warning. They establish command structures at high levels. The statutes do not describe individual posts guarding territory. Authority is articulated as jurisdiction over domains. In the Arctic, exclusive economic zones extend authority offshore. International law defines these zones. States publish coordinates and claim rights over resources. The enforcement mechanisms are described separately in Coast Guard regulations. The claim itself stands without naming custodians. Aviation authority provides another example. Notices to airmen declare restricted or controlled airspace. The notices cite regulations and responsible authorities, often ministries or agencies. They do not identify personnel. Pilots comply with the notice, not with an individual. Maritime law functions similarly. Notices to mariners announce safety zones and exclusions. The authority issuing the notice is named institutionally. Enforcement is implied through maritime law. The document itself carries weight without reference to enforcement action. In administrative correspondence, this abstraction persists. Letters from polar agencies often begin with references to statutory authority. Decisions are justified by regulation numbers. Signatures belong to offices rather than individuals. Continuity is maintained through institutional identity. Archival material shows that this practice is intentional. Drafting guidelines for legal texts emphasize neutrality and longevity. Naming individuals would tie authority to temporary roles. Abstract language ensures continuity beyond personnel changes. Cold War documentation reinforces this pattern. Declassified memoranda concerning Arctic defense reference zones of responsibility. Maps show sectors assigned to commands. The documents name commands, not commanders. Authority is distributed through hierarchy without visible custodians. International agreements adopt even more detached language. United Nations documents concerning polar research reference member states and competent authorities. Responsibilities are allocated without personal attribution. The effect is collective governance without a face. In public-facing materials, this absence is more pronounced. Websites of polar agencies list mandates and legal bases. Staff directories exist separately. Authority is presented as a function of law rather than presence. This structure affects how disputes are handled. When questions arise about access or compliance, responses cite regulations. Appeals are addressed to agencies, not individuals. The process is impersonal. Historical cases illustrate this. In 1985, a dispute arose over scientific access to a protected Antarctic area. Correspondence between national programs cites treaty articles and management plans. No enforcement action is described. Resolution occurs through agreement rather than intervention. The same pattern appears in Arctic shipping disputes. When vessels violate ice navigation rules, notices cite statutes and penalties. Enforcement actions are recorded, but the authority derives from law. The person enforcing is secondary. Academic analysis notes this feature of polar governance. Scholars describe it as rule-based rather than presence-based. Authority exists in text and procedure. Physical enforcement is minimal due to environment and scale. This absence of named custodians contributes to perceptions of remoteness. Without visible guards or officials, authority appears diffuse, yet it remains effective through compliance mechanisms. Documents themselves become instruments of control. Permits, notices, treaties, and statutes shape behavior. They require acknowledgement. They do not require confrontation. Over time, layers of authority accumulate. Older proclamations coexist with newer regulations. Each references the other. None designate a singular guardian. The resulting system operates through recognition. States recognize each other's documents. Operators recognize notices. Researchers recognize permits. Authority is maintained through mutual acknowledgement. In this environment, the idea of a guardian is replaced by governance. Control is asserted without embodiment. Responsibility is distributed across institutions. The record reflects this design. Files contain declarations, not patrol rosters. Laws define zones, not watch posts. Authority is present but unassigned. This form of governance aligns with polar realities. Extreme conditions limit enforcement. Legal clarity substitutes for physical presence. Authority is stated, not shown. The language remains consistent across decades. It is restrained, procedural, and abstract. It names responsibilities but not keepers, logistics corridors and the spaces between. Movement in polar regions follows narrow paths. These paths are shaped by terrain, weather, fuel range, and rescue feasibility. Over time, they become standardized. Routes are reused, adjusted slightly, and reinforced through repetition. Outside these corridors, activity drops sharply. The contrast between concentrated movement and surrounding inactivity defines much of polar access. In the Arctic, maritime corridors developed first. Early whaling routes in the 17th and 18th centuries traced predictable patterns along ice edges. Ship logs from Dutch and British fleets show repeated use of the same passages season after season. Captains favoured routes where ice behaviour was known. Deviations were rare and usually forced by weather. As commercial shipping expanded, these informal routes became charted lanes. The Northern Sea Route along Russia's coast illustrates this progression. Soviet planners in the 1930s identified a sequence of navigable segments supported by ports, weather stations, and icebreakers. Official maps highlight these lanes clearly. Adjacent waters remain lightly detailed. The corridor concentrates movement. The surrounding sea is left largely unused. Canada's Northwest Passage exhibits a similar pattern. Despite public attention, actual transit follows a limited number of channels. Coast Guard records show repeated use of specific straits where ice conditions are manageable. Other channels are avoided due to shallow depths or unpredictable ice. The result is a thin network of movement through a vast archipelago. Aviation corridors follow comparable logic. Early polar flights required precise planning, aircraft range, and emergency landing options dictated routes. In the 1940s, transpolar aviation routes were established between North America and Europe. These routes pass near weather stations and refueling points. Flight charts mark these corridors prominently. Large surrounding areas show no regular air traffic. Modern aviation retains this structure. Polar flight tracks published by international aviation authorities show dense clusters along approved corridors. Deviations require authorization and contingency planning. The spaces between routes remain unused except for occasional research flights. Airspace exists, but movement is selective. In Antarctica, logistics corridors are even more pronounced. Most activity originates from a small number of coastal hubs. McMurdo Station supports inland operations through defined flight paths and overland traverses. Maps produced by national programs show these routes as lines cutting across the ice. Beyond them, vast areas show no regular access. Overland traverses rely on flagged routes. Crews mark paths with poles and GPS coordinates. These routes are reused annually when conditions allow. Travel outside them increases risk due to crevasses and whiteout conditions. Safety manuals instruct personnel to remain within established corridors. The surrounding terrain is left untouched. Fuel logistics reinforce this concentration. Aircraft and vehicles operate near their range limits. Fuel caches are placed along known routes. Establishing new caches requires significant effort and approval. As a result, Existing corridors become self-reinforcing. Movement concentrates where support exists. Rescue capability further constrains access. Emergency response plans rely on proximity to stations and routes. Areas beyond reachable distance are effectively inaccessible. Permit applications reflect this reality. Proposals that require travel outside established corridors face additional scrutiny. Denials often cite rescue limitations. Scientific fieldwork mirrors these patterns. Researchers select sites near logistical support. Data density maps show clusters of sampling around stations and routes. Large interior regions have sparse data. This uneven coverage reflects access constraints rather than research interest alone. Environmental management plans acknowledge this imbalance. Protected areas are often designated in regions with existing access. Remote areas remain unmanaged simply because they are rarely visited. The absence of activity becomes a form of protection. Historical records show that attempts to expand corridors are cautious. New routes are tested incrementally. Pilot traverses assess ice stability and fuel needs. Reports document conditions in detail. Only after repeated success does a route become standard. When routes are abandoned, the process is gradual. Changing ice conditions or infrastructure closure reduces use. Maps update slowly. Former corridors fade from planning documents. The surrounding spaces remain unchanged. This corridor-based access creates large zones of non-use. These zones are not declared off-limits. They are simply impractical to reach. Official documents describe them as unsurveyed or unserved. The language reflects logistical reality. Satellite imagery reinforces this pattern. Tracks of vehicles and aircraft are visible along known routes. The rest of the surface shows minimal disturbance. Oversight systems monitor corridors closely. Outside them, monitoring is passive. Economic considerations also play a role. Establishing new routes requires investment. Governments prioritize existing infrastructure. Budgets reinforce established patterns. New corridors are rare. Private expeditions encounter the same constraints. Commercial operators offering polar travel advertise routes aligned with logistical support. Insurance requirements discourage deviation. Clients are taken along known paths. The experience is structured. Even military operations reflect corridor logic. Exercises use established ranges and routes. Temporary extensions are planned carefully. After exercises conclude, movement returns to normal patterns. The surrounding areas remain unused. The spaces between corridors accumulate little documentation. Maps show them as uniform surfaces. Reports mention them only in passing. They exist as background rather than focus. This absence shapes perception. Areas without tracks, data points, or routes appear empty. Official records do not fill this emptiness with explanation. They simply note the lack of activity. Over time, corridors become synonymous with access itself. To be reachable is to lie near a route. To be distant is to remain outside routine consideration. This distinction is practical rather than ideological. The structure persists because it works. Concentrated routes reduce risk and cost. They simplify oversight. They allow predictable scheduling. The surrounding spaces remain stable through non-use. The record reflects this balance. Documents detail routes precisely. They describe support points and schedules. The areas between are left undescribed. This pattern continues across decades. New technologies adjust routes slightly but do not dissolve them. Movement remains narrow. The spaces between remain largely untouched. In polar governance, access is shaped less by prohibition than by pathway. Corridors define where people go. The rest remains quiet by default. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and let me know your thoughts in the comments. It helps the video reach more people who enjoy this kind of quiet, research-driven documentary. If you want to see more long-form videos like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next upload.